I've been making music for about 2 decades now, and just in the past 6 or 7 years, people have actually started listening to some of it, which has been kind of a nice surprise, I have to say. But even still, sometimes I just feel like I've run out of all of my good ideas. And whenever that happens, I go back to my very first composition lesson. And in that lesson, my composition teacher gave me something that has continued to help me to this day. And I've come to call it a prompt, a term I was using even before all of the super cool AI kids. In that lesson with Italian-American composer Luigi Zanninelli, he gave me a very specific assignment. It was one of my very first assignments, in which I was supposed to write a set of children's pieces for piano, which was my primary instrument, so that made a lot of sense. And if he had just stopped there and said, go write some children's pieces, I would have been insulted and confused at the same time. It's like, why am I just writing children's pieces? And also, where do I start? How in the world do I write a set of children's pieces for piano? It would have been way too open-ended, and no doubt I would have written some super cliche nonsense that was kind of meandering and unfocused and all over the place. But in his infinite wisdom, his one rule was that I could only have 3 notes sounding at a time. In other words, no chord could contain more than 3 notes. In other words, do more with less. He basically gave me a defined problem to solve, and that forced me to come up with solutions that I would have never even considered otherwise. So that's exactly what I did. That gave me a reference point, and that turned into the set of waltzes that you're listening to right now. So I discovered that I could have more than 3 parts if I wanted, if I figured out clever ways to sort of play them off each other. And that would avoid breaking the rule that he gave me of having more than 3 notes sounding at a time. And I think this was the first time it really hit me just how limitations can impact our creativity. It focuses our creativity instead of restricting it. He was so clever in this assignment in that he got me to reveal that to myself just by giving me a simple guideline. So you may have seen Brian Eno's oblique strategies, and I've started kind of doing something very similar for myself when composing, which is just giving myself a prompt. It can be very simple, it can be somewhat abstract, but then I have to figure out creative ways to use that prompt. Really just some compositional guidelines to help me get out of the occasional rut that I find myself in. And I think we probably all find ourselves in that rut from time to time. So in this video, I'm just going to show you a couple of examples that I've been using recently so that you can see how to start to apply this concept for yourself, and hopefully it can help get you out of your ruts as well. Back when I was a student singing in college choirs, one of my directors had this tuning exercise that we would use as a warm-up before rehearsals. And he would have us just sing a 4-part chord. In other words, each one of us, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, had our own assigned part, our own assigned note to hold. And then while the other 3 parts held their notes, he would start moving one of the parts chromatically in half steps. And then he would start moving 2 parts at a time. And depending on which parts he moved and when he moved them, it resulted in some really interesting harmonies that we probably never would have come up with if we were just thinking about vertical chord progressions. So I've been thinking, what if I took this idea, this concept, and turned it into a compositional prompt for myself, since I'm always talking about how to write linearly and horizontally instead of thinking in vertical chords. So this prompt kind of forces us into that way of thinking that I describe in my free composition ebook, which is down in the description below. It gives a lot of these concepts that I found super helpful if you're interested. If you find yourself stuck in a set key signature or something, or a very functional way of thinking about putting chords and harmonies together, chromaticism is a great way to get yourself out of that way of thinking, because you have to think about how each part moves to the next note in the next chord. And basically the entire chromatic scale is available to you instead of being stuck in a mode or a key. Since we're already thinking about chromaticism, let's try something else along those lines. A lot of times when I'm improvising at church, and sometimes I'll improvise the offertory or something, I like to start with dissonant intervals that maybe obscure where I'm going or where I am at the time, so the listener isn't quite sure. And then I like to try to figure out ways to work my way out of that into something that makes sense. When we're composing, this is kind of like trying to write yourself out of a corner. Like, if I'm any good, I should be able to make this work by what I do with it. So for this prompt, let's have a 5-interval sequence that repeats. The starting pitch, the starting note for both parts is going to be middle C, and then I'm going to start moving outward chromatically. To make things more interesting and give myself a little bit more opportunity for contrast, I can have one part that has one leap in it. In other words, an interval larger than a half or whole step. I can also have one whole step in one of the voices. So all chromatic movement except one leap and one whole step somewhere I can choose. So then I might come up with something like this. If you've been around a while, you've probably heard me say something along the lines of changing the bass changes everything. So now I can take this weird sequence and experiment with different root notes underneath it, different bass notes underneath it, different harmonic rhythms based on how fast the bass changes. So let's choose 3 different bass notes to try under this sequence as a whole, and then experiment with changing them at different times during the sequence, just to see what happens. Trial and error. It's an empirical process. So are you starting to see how this can lead to really inspiring and interesting results that we would have never considered or stumbled upon if we were just sort of meandering around, jamming away with an arpeggiator? Anytime we start with a blank page, we either go to what we've already done a million times before, or we're so overwhelmed that we just start throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks, and a lot of times it just sounds unfocused and incoherent by the time we get to the end. This is when overwhelm typically kicks in for me. But just having something to anchor us, as simple as these prompts are, that allows us to explore more freely because we are tethered to something. It's like we have an anchor, and then we can explore around that and see what interesting things are there without the fear of getting lost at sea. If you'd like to see another example of how I use limitations to help glue my pieces and arrangements together, make them more focused, you should watch this video right here where I take a simple melody and through reharmonizing that melody, I'm able to get a lot more mileage out of it.